We have Dinesh Kanabar, the Deputy Chief Executive Chairman of the tax vertical from KPMG, joining us. Thank you so much for joining us, Dinesh. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, I can.
Great. So tell us what happens next if the government has now amended the IT Act with retrospective effect?
So the government proposal is still in a bill form. So here was something where a review petition was pending. And review petition, it's very, very rare for the Supreme Court to reverse its judgment. It is only when there is an error which is apparent from the order. Here was an order which was a very, very reasoned order. So the question of there being an apparent error did not arise, and therefore the Supreme Court has dismissed the review petition. We now have the finance bill, and that bill has yet to be legislated and converted into an act. And there are, of course, a number of representations which are happening on the bill. So we'll have to see as to how does the bill finally get enacted and get converted into law. And then depending on that, there may be certain further proceedings which may arise at that point of time.
Mr. Kanabar, what is, in your opinion, the government's next move? Is it certain that the government will file another petition once the finance bill is cleared?
That will be difficult to say, really. It is difficult to predict as to what will the government do. First of all, as I explained, there is enough and more representation happening to the government on whether it should go ahead and amend the provisions as they are in the bill. Because the way the provisions are drafted in the bill, there is, for example, no room for a proration of assets in India. There is nothing to give a set-off for taxes paid overseas. So I'm pretty sure that the government will have a hard look at the provisions as they are. And then depending on what the final provisions come up, the question will be that the Supreme Court order has now become final, and therefore the limited question will be whether the government will want to reopen the whole thing or not, depending on how the finance bill moves into an act.
Mr. Kanabar, the obvious question that follows from that is that if the government were to really open this case and relook at it with the legislation that they have brought in with the retrospective effect, and many people in the finance ministry, trust me, believe that they will go ahead and do that, does that essentially mean that Vodafone's legal options then are restricted to perhaps invoking the bilateral investment treaty that it has with India? Because remember, this is a Netherlands-based company that they're talking about. Or what, according to you, are the legal recourse that Vodafone could turn to at this stage?
There could be a number of things. So, for example, Vodafone may want to examine the constitutional validity of an amendment. There are two parts to the amendment. One is the amendment to the substantive law, and the other is the amendment to the withholding tax provisions. And I'm sure Vodafone will be seeking legal counsel as to whether it can approach the Supreme Court to say, if at all thereafter the proceedings were revived by the tax office, Vodafone could as well approach the Supreme Court to say that any amendment of this nature, whether it is constitutionally valid or not, A, on the substantive part and B, on the withholding part. Remember that if a withholding provision has to be interpreted, it can be interpreted only in accordance with the law as it stood at that point of time. Even if you amend the law later on retrospectively, a question which would arise is, can you really impose a withholding tax obligation retrospectively?
We've got another guest joining in on the phone line, and we'll go straight across to him. We've, of course, got Mr. Rajshri Sabnavis on the phone line. Thank you very much for joining us. What do you make of the fact that the government's review plea, the one that was filed very ambitiously, despite a very unanimous Supreme Court verdict, has been dismissed by the Supreme Court today? What's your first take on this?
Hi, this is Rajshri. It's Miss Rajshri, sorry. Wanted to clarify. And, my view on the Supreme Court having dismissed the petition is clearly if the government had intended to bring in a retrospective amendment, and that too vis-a-vis bringing in a specific charge, as Mr. Kanabar rightly said, where was the intent? And so it is not very surprising that the Supreme Court has dismissed the review petition, because clearly this was not, this intent was not clearly laid out, at least for the past number of acts or the bills that have been passed. Because one must be mindful of the fact that, even if they have introduced this retrospective amendment, it dates back to 50 years. And I think that was really a key issue which probably the courts would have, looked at.
But what happens in the interim? I mean, the court has dismissed the plea here. The government has brought about a retrospective legislation which in all probability will become an act once, of course, the parliament gives its approval to the financial bill. What happens in the interim? I mean, Vodafone is liable to pay tax if that becomes the legislation and if at all the government does raise a tax query, doesn't it?
Okay. Assuming that, the bill is passed in the way, in the current form without... Hello?
Please carry on, ma'am. We can hear you.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Assuming that the bill is passed in the current form and, it's basically, if it is law, clearly, as far as the decision in case of Vodafone is concerned, that is something which is binding. What is surprising is that there's also a validating provision which has been inserted again retrospectively in the current legislation. To be, from a clearly administrative standpoint, one would, wait and watch to see if the refund that was due or if the refund, as the law stands as of today, there is a refund which is due to Vodafone. And the question is that will the department issue this refund and try to reclaim it back once the act, once this bill is law? I guess we'll have to just wait and watch. But clearly, as the law stands as of today, the amount is due to Vodafone.
We've got Pranav Saita who's joining us on the phone line as well. Mr. Saita, I appreciate you joining us. You were with us on the budget day, and especially when Finance Minister did announce that draconian retrospective tax legislation that the government wants to bring about. You were very vocal that day. How surprised, are you with the fact that the Supreme Court has dismissed the government's review petition, or is it along expected lines? And like all our other guests have been saying, Vodafone still can't breathe easy because they've got this whole sword of the retrospective tax legislation hanging on their head.
So I'm not surprised with the fact that the Supreme Court has dismissed the review petition. That was in fact anticipated. And the Supreme Court has given a very clear verdict earlier, which they have reaffirmed to dismissal of the review petition. Yes, so there is a proposal before Parliament as per the finance bill. If that finance bill is passed, what would be the consequences would be looked at as and when that becomes law, if that bill is passed as it is. Hello?
So what you're essentially saying here is that despite the fact that the Supreme Court has dismissed this review plea, Vodafone cannot breathe easy because there is a tax legislation that is in the work. This tax legislation will perhaps be approved by Parliament and will become a law. That's exactly what you're saying right here.
That is right. So if this bill is passed by Parliament as is, then yes, either it will have to be challenged on grounds of constitutionality, or Vodafone will probably have to pay the taxes.
So when you say Vodafone will have to pay the taxes or it can be challenged on the grounds of constitutionality, besides those two possibilities, what is the legal recourse that Vodafone has, if at all?
The legal recourse, if this particular bill were to become law, if it were to be passed, I would feel the legal recourse would be to challenge it on grounds of constitutionality and reasonableness. I'm not too sure whether there's any other legal recourse available to Vodafone other than to challenge the correctness and constitutional validity of this amendment.
Right. Mr. Pranav, what do you foresee happening, let's say today, where by legally the government needs to pay the money to Vodafone by tonight? Do you think the government will actually respect that deadline?
Well, it's not for me to say so, but I think it would, because there's a Supreme Court order directing that the money should be refunded. So my feeling would be that yes, the money is likely to probably be refunded today. And if and when the bill does become law, as I said, then certainly, because it is a retrospective amendment, they could probably try and see how it can be recovered at that stage.
To Mukesh Bhutani, who's the chairman of BMR Advisors and managing partner of BMR Legal, on to the big news that the Supreme Court has dismissed the review petition that was filed by the government on the Vodafone tax case. Mukesh, thanks so much for joining us. First, your reactions. The the review petition has been dismissed, but on the other hand, the finance bill does have IT changes, IT Act changes with retrospective effect. Where do we go from here now?
Well, the fact that the review petition has been dismissed is certainly a welcome news. And essentially what this means is that the Supreme Court is saying that our order of January 16 does not require a review. What is also hidden in that message is that we do not want to take into consideration the retrospective amendments that you have moved. So Vodafone has a stamp of approval that the decision stands and the review is dismissed. Now, what is important is to bear in mind is the finance bill changes which have retrospective amendments. Now, if these changes go through both the houses of parliament and it becomes an act, that's the time another debate will spring up. Now, bear in mind that the parliament has unfettered powers to legislate, including legislating retrospective changes. And there is no doubt about it. Now, retrospective changes that impose a charge or tax have also been held to be valid by the courts. Courts, however, have taken the view that if these retrospective changes which impose a tax are arbitrary or unreasonable, or they violate any fundamental rights, then those can be challenged under Article 14. So let's say, for instance, that Vodafone, that the finance bill, becomes an act, and after it becomes an act, clearly a similar Vodafone kind of transactions could be questioned. Vodafone cannot be questioned because they went through the entire process of getting a verdict from the Supreme Court. However, the problem doesn't end there, because you have to read the amendments along with a clause called the validation clause that has also been moved as an integral part of the finance bill. Now, a validation clause is not, if it is read along with the retrospective amendment, it tends to validate all past acts of the tax administration and negate that Supreme Court decision as well. I think that is where the problem starts.
Right,
that is where a right arises. Yeah.
Yeah, Mukesh, hold your thoughts. We'll get in Nishit Desai as well, who's the managing partner at law firm Nishit Desai and Associates. Now, Nishit, you've been hearing Mukesh Bhutani as well. He has welcomed this particular move that the Supreme Court has dismissed this particular review petition. But what will happen if the IT Act changes made in the finance bill proposal that is enacted later, say after 2 months? What happens then? Does the government go back to the Supreme Court for another review petition, or what is the procedure then?
I think, first of all, I'm not surprised with Supreme Court's decision today. I was expecting the same thing, so definitely it's a welcome move, as Mukesh mentioned. And but my take is that if the whole thing goes through legislation, it passes through, obviously there will be constitutional challenge. And it remains to be seen to what extent this, retrospective taxation is what one would call unjust or unwarranted, and it puts kind of unwarranted burden on the assessee. And based on that, there would be possible challenges. And I understand in the past there have been, validation of retroactive amendments by the court. But I'm sure it will have to be revisited. And what are the limits to the retroactive amendments as has been proposed? We'll also go into the facts and circumstances of the case. And but certainly this will be a challengeable kind of amendment, I would think. There is no clear cut. I would not say that right, left, and center. Parliament can just do anything beyond constitutional, provisions. So I would think that would be the first thing, that there will be some kind of challenge to the amendment.